Did you know that tempura, one of the world's favorite Japanese dishes, is actually rooted in Portuguese cuisine and preparation? It was during the time the Portuguese traded extensively with Japan back in the 16th to 17th century called the Nanban trade. They exchanged resources and goods like Chinese silk, tobacco, and guns for Japanese silver before they were kicked out of the country when Japan closed its borders in 1639. But even with the Portuguese banished, their influence remained especially in food and cuisine. One of the biggest things the Portuguese introduced would probably be deep frying. I mean, before the Portuguese came, deep frying food wasn't a commonly practiced method with the Japanese. And now, we find deep frying, not just tempura, to be a welcome part of Japanese cuisine. Tempura and the act of deep frying has been embraced and made Japanese, elevated to an art form. But the journey tempura took to become what it is now was a long, long road of evolution. And throughout time, we can find dishes that carry on the essence of tempura, eventually turning this Portuguese dish into a Japanese icon. So, what is tempura? Well, tempura is fish, shrimp, or vegetables dipped in flour, dipped in a very thin batter called koromo, which is egg and wheat flour mixed with cold water, and then deep fried in oil. That is tempura. It's light and crispy in contrast to other traditionally deep-fried foods, which often end up very greasy and heavy. It is a true Japanese icon. But before tempura got to that point, it had a lot of evolution to go through. Let's go back to the beginning. The origins of tempura are quite hazy. Let's first take a look at its etymology. There is no etymology in Japanese. But some people say that it came from templo, or temple in Spanish, or tempero in Portuguese, meaning to season. Some would even say that it is a Japanese coined term, but the most credible sounding theory would be that it came from tempora, or quatuor tempora, which is Latin for 4 days. This Latin origin would make the most sense since along with Portuguese goods and trade also came the Portuguese's religion, Christianity. Quatuor tempora is also known as the Ember Days or the time of Lent for Christians, where they would abstain from eating meats and would instead partake of fish and vegetables instead. So why would this make sense? Well, let's take a look at the dishes that tempura may have came from. Tempura came from a long line of dishes that eventually turned into what it is today. It's like a family tree or a Pokemon evolution chart that stemmed from 2 or 3 potential dishes. What we do know for a fact is that tempura's origin stemmed from the Nanban trade. Here, the Portuguese left 3 dishes that have potential tempura jumping off points. Pashinas de horta was one of the meals that Portuguese Christians would eat during the Ember Days, or Lent. It's a green bean dish which meant little fish of the garden. It was dipped in flour and batter and then dipped in hot oil. Sounds familiar? The other plausible candidates for tempura would be from a compilation of recipes called the Southern Barbarian Cookbook, a cookbook containing multiple recipes of Iberian and Portuguese origin. While tempura wasn't listed down in the cookbook, 2 dishes seem quite similar to it, to which author Rath says they serve as precursors to tempura. Tenpurari and uon no riori, a chicken dish and a fried fish dish respectively. Well, tempurari is a bit odd not only because it is chicken, but because of the liberal use of spices and seasonings. Rath states that to make tempurari, you must use powdered black pepper, powdered cinnamon, and powdered cloves, and finely chopped ginger, onions, and garlic. You must prepare a chicken. Sauté the 6 seasonings in a pan with oil, add the chicken, and continue cooking. You then color with water infused with gardenia, adding this to the stock. Then you add fresh sauce and flavor with seasoned sake. It mentions a lot of spices that honestly didn't make the cut in the modern dish. The other dish, uo no riori, makes a much better candidate for tempura, which was a fried fish dish. It is fine to use any fish. Cut the fish into round slices, douse in flour, and fry in oil. Afterwards, sprinkle with powdered clove and grated garlic. Prepare a stock as desired and simmer. With these 3 dishes, we can divide them to 2 different categories. One that is fried in oil and served in a broth, and the other is a dish that is batter dipped and fried in oil. And throughout history, we could see dishes emerging that seemed to be offshoots of this Portuguese formula. And yet, there was no clear definition of the word tempura. During the Edo period, an author noted that tempura referred to a fish fried in oil and served in a broth, or a batter-fried fish and vegetable dish. Even a fried fish paste with mullet roe and served with stock and soy sauce, green onion, and grated daikon were called as tempura as well. This is known as satsume age now. Eventually, the author notes, nowadays, any fish coated in batter and fried in oil and served in a hot broth is called tempura. The definition broadened to include any fish coated in batter and deep fried in oil, very similar to what we know as tempura today. Through time, the broth was dropped altogether, and by 1748, they would define it as any fish covered with flour used for udon and then deep fried in oil. But why this evolution? Perhaps we can attribute this to adaptation of the dish into something more appealing to the Japanese palate. The degree of local adaptation may be seen in dishes where the main ingredient has changed from meat to fish, or dairy products are conspicuously absent, or seasonings such as miso or soy sauce are used. For the course of change in the modern Japanese diet has not been one of striving to alter the local cuisine into Western or Chinese forms, but rather of reorganizing the traditional meal by selecting foreign elements and adapting them to Japanese forms. Western foods were adopted by the Japanese, modified, and eventually became Japanese foods in their own right. We can even see this in the casutera or Castilla cake that the Portuguese brought. Now, it has evolved into a cake that is very different from the original recipe that was given to them. The dish adapts to the people it serves. The original casutera was the pão de ló brought by the Portuguese, or as it was known in Japan, pão de castella. The Japanese adapted this cake into their own style, and it emerged as casutera, similar to its predecessor but standing on its own as a recipe. Now, it is a popular souvenir food in Nagasaki. So when we put the tempura through this lens, we can see that the dishes changed to favor the Japanese palate, changing and evolving to the point that it is no longer Portuguese and now completely Japanese. But it was only during the Edo period where tempura really hit its prime form as we know it today. Deep frying as a culinary practice was practically limited to the higher class due to the expensive and limited nature of sesame oil. Mainly, it would be used for lamps. But when rapeseed oil was widely produced, the price of sesame oil went down. Coincidentally, according to Ishige, this was around the same time tempura became incredibly popular. And that time was the Edo period. The Edo period, among many other things, was considered the time that Japanese cuisine advanced culturally and spread like wildfire, establishing several national dishes, soba noodles, grilled eel, sushi, and of course, tempura. It was also the period where the expansion of the culture of dining out began. The tempura among the other foods would be served at street stalls called yatai. These stalls would serve families and the single male labor force who couldn't cook. The streets would be decorated with these stalls with smells wafting throughout, inviting customers in. Tempura wouldn't be served inside buildings as frying oil was a fire hazard. So instead, they would cook in front of the customers and they can eat as the chefs cook their dish one tempura at a time. They wouldn't be eaten with chopsticks. Instead, the pieces of fish, shrimp, and vegetables were on bamboo skewers in their deep-fried tempura glory, served with a dipping sauce and radish on the side. It was cheap, fast food that was eaten on the spot, standing. At the peak of popularity, there would be many as 3 or 4 tempura shops to each block. Eventually, tempura shifted in the Meiji period to not only be a common folk food, but a food that can be served in restaurants as a higher class food. And time goes on and on and on until it leads us today where the tempura is at its finest form and revered as a Japanese icon. And there you have it. Tempura in all its glory. What was once possibly a Lenten dish transformed into a Japanese global icon. The road was interesting, as a simple dish evolved and changed alongside its people into something so unique and different from its base form. It is a marvel. So next time you order a set of tempura, don't forget to appreciate the time and innovation and evolution it took to bring its glorious deep-fried crunchy form.